Professor Chomsky, a couple of questions.
Well, actually, I think let me make a comment first. When Mr. Perle said that he preferred to go second, and I said I had no objection, I assumed that we would keep to the usual format of such discussions, namely that we would each make a statement expressing our opinion. That's not exactly what happened. The format was changed. I made a statement, and you heard a rebuttal. That's a different arrangement. That being the case, I will take this occasion, if I may, to respond to the rebuttal, which in my view was not a proper way to proceed. Let me just comment a little bit on some of those remarks. First, Mr. Perle pointed out that the Soviet Union and the United States are internally very different societies. I absolutely agree, and anybody who can think their way out of a paper bag will notice that that has no relation whatsoever to my comment that in every state you look at, whether it's the Soviet Union or the United States or anyone else, you'll find official pieties, and you'll find a historical and documentary record, and they won't have anything to do with each other. With regard to the reconstruction of Europe, although that wasn't my main topic, I'd be very much interested in talking about it if someone would like to raise questions. Let me just stress again what I said. The United States planned in the highest level planning documents during the war and later to reconstruct Europe in the context of liberal internationalism, in which it was assumed that U.S. interests would prevail, given the relations of power. It's exactly what happened. For example, U.S. investment in Europe skyrocketed. The United States was deeply concerned that if the United States did not reconstruct Japan and Europe, they would associate themselves with our enemies. Japan, it was assumed, would associate itself with China, with the Soviet Union. We had to block this, therefore we had to reconstruct them under our own control. In particular, the control over Middle East oil was always regarded explicitly as a lever to ensure, as George Kennan put it, a veto power over them. Notice that these policies of liberal internationalism in fact worked. Let me stress that the documents that I was citing, of course they're a small selection, were not random comments by this or that person. I was quoting the the most comprehensive statements of the policy planning staff of the State Department and the National Security Council. The statements I quoted are reiterated over and over again, often verbatim, consistently in the documentary record. And they, in fact, as you will discover if you look, represent the core of thinking in the 1940s and the early 1950s when the framework of the current world order was established. As far as Europe was, Mr. Perle is correct when he says that the United States fosters stability and prosperity of a very special kind, the kind in which we can prosper. So it's the kind of stability in which, for example, Honduras exports snow peas and beef, but doesn't feed its own population. And we also foster democracy, namely the kind that we like. So, for example, in the late 1940s, the United States intervened in Japan and in Europe to conduct a reverse course, which destroyed the anti-fascist resistance, which repressed labor, which broke up unions, which broke up the independent media, which reconstructed business control, and in fact restored pretty much the old order, but now within the framework of U.S. power. And in fact, that explains the kind of democracy we want, democracy under business control linked to us. The aid to Nicaragua that Mr. Perle mentioned is a perfect example. The aid did not go to Nicaragua. It went to the business sector in Nicaragua, to the private sector, in an effort to block the Sandinista revolution. Mr. Perle regards it as astonishing that we attempted to drive Nicaragua into the Soviet orbit. Here comes a question. I would like to ask what you think are the consequences of organizing a military force based on the National Guard with the aid of Argentine neo-Nazis to attack a country, then preventing them from getting any military aid from abroad, turning down their request to us for arms, blocking aid from international institutions, launching economic warfare, including finally a blockade. When you attack a country and you prevent them from getting arms from anywhere else except the Soviet Union, exactly what does one think is going to happen? Does it take a genius to conclude that they're going to rely on the Soviet Union? When we instituted that blockade in 1985, Nicaraguan trade with the Soviet Union was in fact 20%. With the whole East Soviet bloc, including Cuba, about the same as ours. much less than Europe, and much less than the Third World. The purpose of the blockade, as the purpose of the attack, was obvious. It would have the intended consequence of forcing the reliance that we require as a retrospective justification for attacking them for quite different reasons. Now, as to the atrocities that are comparable to Pol Pot, again, I urge that you look at U.S. government records. So, for example, the CIA has a demographic study of the Pol Pot regime in which they conclude, they much underestimate in my view, but they conclude that 50 to 100,000 people were killed. More serious estimates put it at several 100,000, and many 100,000s more died from starvation, disease, etc. That's roughly comparable to what happened in Central America in the last decade in scale and in character. Read the reports of the human rights organizations, of the church, and so on, and you will find that the torture, atrocities, mutilation, and so on in Central America is exactly on the style of Pol Pot. Check it and see. As to my calling for the United States to get out of Vietnam in Indochina, let me recall the facts. Through the 1960s, I did call on the United States to terminate its aggression against South Vietnam and its invasion of all of Indochina, exactly as I call on the Soviet Union to terminate its aggression in Afghanistan. By 1970, I pointed out that the effect of U.S. policy was going to be to guarantee that North Vietnam would control all of Indochina, for the simple reason that by that time we had destroyed the indigenous forces in the other countries. It's pretty much what happened. The United States physically destroyed 3 countries. They've undergone a disaster that there's nothing in our history to compare with back to the Black Plague, and in fact you do see the effect of that. If the Russians continue in Afghanistan, you'll see similar effects for similar reasons. As to the Middle East, Mr. Perle says it's bizarre to say that the United States has blocked a diplomatic settlement since 1971. Let me repeat what I said. The United States has blocked a political settlement based on the principle that both national groups have the right to national self-determination. In fact, we even went beyond that. In February 1971, when President Sadat of Egypt offered a full peace treaty to Israel, which offered nothing to the Palestinians on the internationally recognized borders, a proposal which incidentally was virtually identical to official, though not operative, U.S. government policy, the Rogers Plan, Israel refused it, and the United States backed them in that refusal. That led directly to the 1973 war, as was obvious at the time, and constantly reported to Henry Kissinger by oil company executives, ambassadors, and so on. After the 1973 war, the United States recognized that Egypt was not a basket case. It couldn't simply be dismissed. The United States therefore accepted Sadat's long-standing offers to become a U.S. client and moved to exclude Egypt from the conflict. That's the shuttle diplomacy and ultimately Camp David. The purpose and the obvious consequences were that with the Arab deterrent removed, Israel would be free to, that's the biggest Arab military force in the Arab world, Israel would be free to integrate the occupied territories and to attack its northern neighbor, with a huge increase in U.S. aid, reaching about 50% of total aid at that point. Predicted at the time exactly what happened, now acknowledged in retrospect as what happened, as of course it must. That's the one supposed contribution of the United States towards peace. In January 1976, the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution advanced by the Arab states and the PLO for a 2-state political settlement. I won't go through the whole record, but that's continued up until today. What I said is precisely accurate. As for Israel's needing security, here again I urge you to take a look at the documentary record. One learns a lot from it, and you learn a lot from the fact that certain people don't want you to look at it. There's a very extensive documentary record of there's a very extensive documentary record in Hebrew, if any of you have access to it, of Israeli government planning and thinking, cabinet meetings, etc., from 1967 through 1973. I've gone through it in detail. That's the period in which the rejectionist policy was established, peace was rejected, and so on. If you go through it, you'll find virtually no reference to security. That wasn't a concern. The reason is explained repeatedly by Israeli military leaders, General Harkabi, many others. The issue is not security. The issues that what you see discussed there are, for example, you see much more discussion of water, access to water, than you see to security. The point is that Israel does not want to abandon those territories.